In this People and Performance podcast episode, we're going to explore claims that the approach called design thinking is going to become a game changer for HR processes. Design thinking is a process for creative problem solving that's helping HR teams across the globe deliver value, organize their work, and find solutions. At first glance, product design and HR feel about as far apart as any two aspects of work can get. The approach, however, has been lauded by many in the industry as a powerful approach that solves problems through human-centric lenses. Josh Bersin suggests, quote, design thinking transforms HR from a process developer into an experience architect. It empowers HR to reimagine every aspect of work, the physical environment, how people meet and interact, how managers spend their time, and how companies select, train, engage, and evaluate their people, end quote. I am Chris Bjorling from Fidello, where we have a passion for HR consulting and improving performance. Stay tuned and join us today as we delve into design thinking transformation. Our guest expert is Glenn Donaldson, Chief Customer Officer and President of IntelliHR Americas. Glenn is a specialist in HR technology with expertise and passion for product strategy, customer success, and business expansion. And most importantly, he's joining us from all the way down under. I hope you enjoy this conversation Bill Banham and I had with Glenn. Good day, Glenn. It's a pleasure to have you on our podcast today. We're excited about this, and I need to let all of our listeners know that this is actually 4 a.m. when we're recording this for you. So from down under, and we appreciate you being here with us. So let me ask you some things as we get into here. So before we get into the value you see in design thinking as a methodology for leaders in the HR to improve overall performance, let's take a few minutes to understand the basics. Can you start by explaining the differences between it and traditional quote unquote waterfall project management approach, where projects are divided into different stages and each stage has to be completed before the project can move on to the next?
Yeah, for sure. And g'day back to you, Chris. It's great to be on the podcast. Look, I think, design thinking is such an interesting methodology that's really started to emerge, I'd say over the past 4 or 5 years into the HR world. And where we've really start to see it play out is in the form of software implementations and particularly, project management in that sense. And effectively, I always say that design thinking, the best way to describe it is it's really that empathy approach to unpacking a particular process or project rollout. And it basically gives you the opportunity as you're designing processes or implementing certain projects and whatnot to really empathize with the end user's experience. So who will actually be benefiting from the process, who's going to be involved through the process, what are their actual journeys or experiences throughout it. And that might seem like a little bit of a fluffy way to think about designing a project, but at the end of the day, we're dealing with people and humans, and that sort of human factor always comes in to the success of a particular process, right? So we really need to understand or better understand how a person is going to react and shape a process playing out. You can't fully automate something and not expect those factors to have an effect there. So really, design thinking helps, I would say, the mapping out and the understanding of that. And then it allows us to really iterate and make sure that those processes are to their full form and effective as possible. And I guess that's a little bit different to, say, the waterfall approach. And although it's chalk and cheese, and there might be slightly in different areas of explanation, but waterfall project management, is very traditional. You've obviously got the staged approaches where there's a lot of hierarchy or approval that comes into play. And design thinking is a little bit more different because you tend to involve other stakeholders that might not traditionally have been involved in the project from the get-go. And so we see a lot of that play out in different areas.
I love that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. A bit of a follow-up for you then. So in the waterfall project management approach, projects are often led by a senior exec and hierarchy is fairly rigid. Talk to us about the autonomy that design thinking as a different approach gives to teams and how that can keep them ahead of the competition.
So this is a really interesting one. So design thinking, where I've seen it very successful is again when you're involving a lot of different stakeholders there. So you might put together a project team and they'll do a waterfall approach, and you roll out project X, and there's different phases to it. Really, where I see design thinking playing into that is it's more so a component of how that project is put together, or the process is designed. So, for instance, a lot of the time, like you just said, Bill, it's very senior executive, top heavy, involved in the decision making process. What we tend to find is through the various processes that design thinking adapt or enable, you tend to actually have your end users, which I don't really like saying top or bottom employees, but more so, the different area of departments and so on actually contributing to the end process and decision making there. So a really good example of that would be, when you're redesigning an onboarding process, for instance, using design thinking. Obviously, the entire onboarding process has been is in place for the employee's experience. How are they onboarded into a business? What's their actual experience through that whole process or time frame from the minute that they're hired, so they haven't even started in the business, right through to their probation, maybe even a year or two into the future with the company. What's that entire experience? Well, why should senior executives be the only um, uh, group to be making decisions on what that person's experience should be? And I think that's really where I get excited about design thinking, because if you involve those end users into the iteration and the decision making around what that process could look like through design thinking, that's again where we're seeing that empathy come into play. We're seeing different experiences or different rituals or processes coming in that might not have traditionally been thought of, if we're keeping it quite hierarchy and rigid, which again we see that in that waterfall approach.
Okay, so maybe you need to recap a little bit, but why is it such a game changer then, Glenn? Why is design thinking such an awesome approach to adopt when it comes to the fact that it's that human-centric approach? It allows people to work a bit more on their own and try new things as well. Why does that lead to a happier company culture and more productivity? I guess is the point, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is where, not to kind of take it off topic a little bit, but where I see it as a game changer is design thinking through the means of implementing software and different applications or processes is starting to really promote this changing landscape that I can see emerging out of HR professionals, or the HR professions, sorry. And that's really around, where is the next challenge for HR? Well, I believe it's starting to be what our leaders have autonomy of, and what our leaders are actually enabled to do in the HR spectrum. We've traditionally had a lot of our hands on a lot of HR data before, attrition, engagement data, and whatnot. But these applications that are out on the market, we're starting to see their tools are being very decentralized from HR and given to leaders. And so when we pull that back into the design thinking concept, we've got processes or software that's being purchased by HR, that's being implemented by HR, but ultimately the actual tools and the value is there for the leaders to enable their teams and enable performance conversations and so on. So where design thinking kind of fits into that spectrum is really involving the leaders and the end users into the iteration again of the processes, and so they're in turn helping build what that best approach is going to be. And I think that's again where the game changer is. It's that whole concept around empathy and employee experience and so on, and that really shapes and forms the success of any sort of process. And again, I'm more so based in HR, so I always bring it back to HR. But you could actually apply this to any sort of concept in businesses. But again, it's really that solution orientated approach around better optimizing a particular process, not just for HR though. We're starting to see this help optimize it for the people that are actually benefiting from this, and in turn, that's our people, that's our employees.
Brilliant. So, yeah, it begs the question for us, and some of the things that work that we run parallel with in my space. And I just want to ask some questions about this. So, as you start to think about what I'm going through here, what about the measuring performance based on competencies. My Fidelity team and I help companies involve their people in more in the planning and carrying out their own development. As part of that, we try to ensure that our clients keep a better track of the skills and knowledge of the people. So my question to you is, does design thinking, as it offers less hierarchy, more autonomy, and some blurred lines of responsibility, does that mean that measuring competencies and rewarding success to individuals is harder? If not, why?
Overall, does it make it harder? Probably not. I think you're right in a sense that sometimes these things can introduce a little bit of a blurred line of responsibility. I think one part that I see design thinking really succeed in is actually mapping out performance competencies and performance-based conversations. So really, at the end of the day, a lot of organizations typically only have one performance process, right? Everyone's somewhat measured on the same sort of values or same sort of metric-based criteria. What we're starting to see a lot more in the market is this need or desire to not only have individual type of performance metrics for different departments, but also being able to somehow streamline or compare those sets against each other, which becomes very difficult because when you're looking at competencies, it's difficult to compare pears and apples. But a lot of organizations are trying to do that and trying to find ways around that. And I think where these sort of concepts start to really sting is that employees, there's a lot of skills and development opportunities on the table with employees, but the trouble is trying to identify where we can actually pull that out and where we can find the most value in that, and also create the pathways for employees to identify them as well. So that's where, again, design thinking really helps to map out those opportunities and connections. But I guess where the blurred line of responsibility starts to come into play is, how do you actually reward an employee when people are being compared against certain data sets? And I think that really comes back to the sort of tools that you're using and being able to make sure that there's sophistication in the actual data that you're mining and you're pulling out there. And I'd say that's something that does relate back to design thinking in a matter of form, because typically how design thinking would actually work in the performance concept is actually starting with the end goal in mind. So starting with what's the actual data sets that we're needing to produce, what are the metrics that we're needing to actually measure on, and then working backwards from there. Whereas in other processes, like say onboarding and offboarding, you're typically starting at the start. What's the start of that process or employee's experience look like? And then working from left to right. So there's a few different methods that we can actually apply there to achieve what we're looking for in that performance realm.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant, and I love the part where you're talking about it being, we're handling a lot of this up front and defining it, and it's just figuring out how to get rewarded from it and how to get it finalized is the thing. And I think if you do the definition up front and you're fluid and agile, I think you're going to make it actually easier in the long run from just this brief conversation we're having here. So anyway, cool. Thank you.
Hey, Glenn, we are coming towards the end of this particular chat, my friend. So listen, as we look to wrap up, we've got this one question that we ask of all of our guests. So you could take it anywhere. You could maybe answer in one word or tell us a little story. But we like to ask our guests, from a culture and people processes perspective, what does a high-performing company mean to you?
Oh, this is a good question, and I feel like I've got a lot of eyes on me while I answer this for 4 o'clock in the morning. What's a high performing company mean to you? Look, I think for me, this is probably a little bit controversial, but I think if your HR department still needs to make most of the decisions that come around HR, I think you need to look inwards, because where I've seen a lot of success around high performing companies and high performing cultures is this cultivating of leaders empowering HR. And again, I mentioned this a little bit earlier on. That is the next wave or challenge for HR, I feel, is our leaders, and the pandemic has really, fast tracked this, but our leaders have really stepped up and emerged in a decentralized world and where we're on Zoom and whatnot. And I think that's where we need to start thinking in HR. What are the tools that we're actually giving leaders and how are we enabling them? Because we know that in turn is going to produce a high performing culture. And so I think, do a little bit of a self-assessment as to what your business currently looks like. Is most of your data still sitting in HR? Is most of that data not making its way to leaders? Do leaders not really have a voice in how their staff are onboarded, in how their staff are measured on particular performance processes? In any of those HR processes, what sort of leader representation is in those areas? Because I think if you're saying that there's not much, then I wouldn't say they're a high performing culture or company. And so that's something that I've always I can start to see emerge a lot more, and I can see a lot more value being added to that argument.
I love that response. Thank you. Hey, Glenn, I do need to let you know, I think you're doing a great job on your accent changes. So don't let Bill get under your skin with that. So I'll leave that with you. Hey, and the last thing we always want to ask is, how can we learn more about you and your efforts?
Look, we can find us at intellihr.com, where I sound like a crazy Australian. I'm based in Brisbane, Australia, but we're global all over. So reach out to us on intellihr.com. And design thinking is a component of what we do when we implement our software. So it's a really exciting experience that we put our customers through when they purchase our software, and we've always believed in not just throwing our software at a company and saying good luck. We want to make sure that it's embedded in, and I almost say design thinking is a little bit of a selfish part on our side, because we really like to embed ourselves in an organization and learn more for them, and that's exactly what design thinking does.
Wonderful. Well, we thank you for your time today, and the time this morning actually, and I don't know if you're going to stay up the rest of the day or go back to bed, but in any case, thank you so much. We learned a lot, and we're excited that our audience had a chance to get the benefits from listening to you. So thank you.
No worries. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Bill. Lovely to catch up again.
This podcast is supported by Fidello Inc., a consulting firm specializing in improving human performance. Through their products and services, Fidello helps clients design, develop, and implement strategic integrated human resource processes and systems. Learn more at fidello.com. That's FIDELLO.com.